The day Celia Ford stopped speaking was the same day Reverend Hobart declared her soul too damaged to save, and from that moment forward, the town of Harrow Creek, Texas, decided she was as good as gone. It was the spring of 1882, and Harrow Creek sat baking under a relentless sun out on the western edge of the hill country, a hardscrabble town of 200 souls who had carved themselves a life from limestone and stubbornness. The main street was nothing more than packed dirt lined with a general store, a blacksmith, a saloon called the Dusty Pitcher, a two-room schoolhouse, and a church with a bell that rang too loud on Sunday mornings. There was a water trough in front of the livery stable and a wooden boardwalk that had been splitting down the middle for 3 years without anyone choosing to fix it. It was the kind of town that remembered everything and forgave nothing. Celia had grown up in Harrow Creek, the daughter of a farmer named Hank Ford who had died of fever when she was 12, leaving her and her mother Margaret to work a modest 40-acre plot on the South Road. Margaret Ford had been a practical, proud woman who taught Celia to sew, to can, to tend a kitchen garden, and to hold her chin up regardless of what the world threw at her face. When Margaret passed from pneumonia the winter Celia turned 20, the town had watched with a mixture of sympathy and something colder, something that looked almost like impatience, wondering what the girl would do now that she was truly alone. What Celia did was keep the farm running. She was 20 years old, straight-backed and dark-haired, with brown eyes that caught the light in a way that made men notice her at church on Sundays. She was not delicate. She could hitch a team and haul water, and mend a fence line when she had to. But she was one woman on 40 acres, and within a year and a half of her mother's death, the bank in Mason County had grown impatient with the mortgage that her father had taken out years ago and never quite settled. What followed was the kind of quiet disaster that no one in Harrow Creek admitted to participating in, but everyone watched without intervening. A man named Denton Creel, who owned the feed store and sat on the town council, quietly purchased the note on the Ford property from the bank and called it due within 60 days. Celia had gone to the mayor, a round-faced man named Gerald Prout, and asked for assistance. Gerald had offered her his condolences and suggested she might consider working in one of the homes along the North Road as a domestic. When she refused, something shifted in the way the town looked at her. She was no longer the unfortunate orphan. She was the stubborn girl who had been given a reasonable exit and refused it. Within 3 months, Denton Creel had possession of the Ford farm. Celia moved into the single room above the seamstress shop, run by a widow named Ada Hollies, who was the closest thing to a friend she had left in Harrow Creek. She took work where she could find it, mending shirts and altering dresses, hauling laundry on Mondays for the 2 boarding houses, and occasionally working the breakfast shift at the Harrow Creek Hotel when the regular girl took ill. Then came the afternoon in October of 1882, when a drifter named Cole Pryor passed through town, helped himself to $3 from the hotel till while Celia was managing the front desk alone, and when she confronted him, backhanded her hard enough that she hit the counter and went down. She was found 20 minutes later by the hotel owner, a thin man named Everett Baines, who immediately concluded that she had been behind the theft and that Pryor's account of a clumsy girl who tried to steal and then fell was more credible than hers. No one searched for Pryor. No one pressed charges. Everett Baines let her go, and the rest of Harrow Creek heard about it within 2 days, and the version that traveled from porch to porch was the one where Celia Ford had been caught stealing. That was when Reverend Hobart made his remark. He had not meant it to leave the small circle of deacons he said it to, but those things never stayed contained in a town the size of Harrow Creek. He had said that some people carried ruin inside them like a seed, and there was nothing a Christian community could do but pray for them from a distance, and the town had taken that permission and used it. Ada Hollies, to her lasting credit, did not believe the theft story. She kept Celia's room available and refused to raise the rent, even when other women on the street began giving her looks for housing someone of questionable character. But even Ada did not fully understand what had happened inside Celia after that October afternoon. It was not that Celia had broken. It was more that she had gone very quiet, in the way that a river goes quiet before it changes course. She moved through her days efficiently, mechanically, her face composed into an expression that people mistook for coldness, but was actually something closer to a woman who had decided that the world was not listening and so had stopped speaking into it. She still said the necessary words. She answered when spoken to. She said good morning to Ada and thank you to the dry goods clerk. But the warmth that had once made her noticeable in a good way had gone still inside her, and Harrow Creek, having no patience for quiet women unless they were quiet in a pleasing, domestic way, concluded that Celia Ford was a lost cause, not worth the trouble of rehabilitation, not worth the conversation. She was 22 years old and already buried in a town that was still technically alive. The new rancher arrived on a Thursday in early April of 1883, which was a full year and a half after everything had gone wrong for Celia, and he arrived the way important things sometimes arrived in that era, without announcement, on a horse that had seen hard miles, and with a wagon behind him loaded with tools and crates, and the kind of organized, purposeful cargo that told you immediately this was not a man passing through. His name was Wallace Weston, and he was 28 years old, broad-shouldered and brown from years of working under the open sky. He had come from east of San Antonio, where he had spent the better part of 6 years as a trail hand on the Kishom drives before saving enough to buy land of his own. He had done his homework on Harrow Creek. He had heard from a land agent in Mason that there was a 40-acre parcel on the South Road with good soil and a decent water source that had recently changed hands and was being offered at a fair price by Denton Creel, who by that point had realized he had no personal interest in farming and simply wanted to recoup his investment. Wallace had bought it through the land agent without ever setting foot in Harrow Creek first, which was a thing that either spoke to his confidence or his recklessness, and after spending an afternoon in town on the day of his arrival, he had not yet determined which one applied to him. He stopped at the general store to pick up supplies and exchange a few words with the owner, a broad man named Leonard Fitch, who was perfectly willing to talk about the town, the soil quality on the South Road, and the particular challenges of the hill country summer. Wallace listened more than he spoke, which was his natural habit, a quality that had served him well on cattle drives where the men who talked the most were usually the ones who noticed the least. He had a quiet, direct way about him, not unfriendly but not eager either, and Leonard Fitch found himself oddly comfortable with the new arrival in a way he could not immediately explain. It was while Wallace was settling his account at the general store that he first saw Celia Ford. She came through the door with a basket over one arm and a short list in her hand, wearing a plain gray dress and a bonnet that she pushed off her head the moment she stepped inside, tucking it under her arm with the absent efficiency of someone who wore bonnets because it was expected, and removed them at the first opportunity. Her dark hair was pinned up but not elaborately, and her brown eyes swept the store with the practiced assessment of a woman who knew exactly what she needed and approximately how much of it she could afford. She did not look at Wallace particularly. She looked at the shelves. Leonard Fitch's expression, however, shifted in a way that was subtle but not invisible to someone paying attention, and Wallace was always paying attention. There was a slight carefulness in how Leonard straightened up, a mild pulling back that was not quite rudeness but was not warmth either. Something in the store changed temperature for about 4 seconds when Celia walked in, and then returned to normal, and the whole thing was the kind of social signal that a man who had spent years reading weather and cattle and the moods of strangers on the trail would catch without quite being able to name it. She placed her order quietly and efficiently. Leonard filled it without conversation. She paid, took her basket, and left. Wallace watched her walk out across the split boardwalk, and he turned back to Leonard Fitch with a casual, idle question in his voice, the way you ask about weather. "Who is she?" Leonard Fitch picked up his pencil and looked at the account book. "Nobody you need to concern yourself with," he said, and his tone was so definitive that it was almost fascinating. Wallace thought about that all the way out of town and along the south road to his newly purchased property, which needed a great deal of work but had good bones, the way that important things often did. He met her properly 3 days later, which happened partly by geography and partly by the fact that Wallace Weston was a man who noticed things and then did something about them, which was a less common quality than people tended to assume. The South Road property he had purchased shared a fence line with a small additional parcel that was unused, a scrubby strip of land between his 40 acres and the creek that fed the property. Celia Ford, as it turned out, had been using that strip of creek access for the past 6 months to water a small kitchen garden she had started on the edge of the unused land, which technically belonged to Denton Creel, and which Celia had simply begun using without formal arrangement, because there was no one watching it and the soil near the creek was good, and she needed to eat. When Wallace came down to assess his water source that Tuesday morning, he found neat rows of early spring vegetables, a well-tended patch of ground that someone had clearly been working for weeks, and Celia Ford on her knees in the dirt with a hand trowel, looking up at him with the expression of a woman who had just been caught at something and was calculating how much it was going to cost her. She stood slowly. She did not apologize immediately, which he respected. She brushed the soil from her hands and looked at him directly and said, "This strip of land belongs to Denton Creel, not to the Ford parcel you purchased. I have been using it without permission. I will move the garden if you require it." Wallace looked at the neat rows. He looked at the creek beyond. He looked back at her. "That strip belongs to me," he said. "I bought the Ford parcel and the creek access strip together. Denton Creel included it in the sale." Something moved across her face that was not quite relief and not quite dread. It was more complicated than either. "Then I will move the garden," she said again. "I apologize for the assumption." "You put a lot of work into this garden," Wallace said, not as a statement designed to soften anything, just as an observation. He was reading the rows the way he read terrain. Carrots, beans, a few squash plants just starting to spread, some onions along the far edge, work that represented weeks, maybe more. "I did," she said. "Where would you move it to?" She looked at him steadily. "I have a window box at the room I rent above Ada Hollies' shop. It would hold 1 tomato plant if I am optimistic." He almost smiled. He held it back because it did not feel like the moment for smiling, and he did not want her to think he was laughing at her situation, which was clearly not a laughing situation. "Keep the garden," he said. She looked at him the way you look at something when you are not sure if it is real. "I will not charge you for the land use," he said. "Seems a poor welcome to a place, sending a woman's garden away." "I'm not asking for charity," she said, and there was an edge in her voice that was not aggressive but was very clear, the edge of someone who had been offered things that came with costs attached and had learned to be cautious about the nature of offers. "I know you are not," Wallace said. "I am not offering charity. I am offering to leave a garden where it already is, which costs me nothing and takes nothing from you. That is a different thing." She studied him for a long moment. "All right," she said finally. "Thank you, Mr. Weston," he said. "Wallace Weston, I bought the Ford parcel." Something flickered in her eyes at the mention of the Ford parcel, a quick, unguarded flash of pain that she controlled almost immediately. But Wallace had seen it. "Celia Ford," she said. He nodded, and because he understood from the way she said it and the way she controlled her expression afterward that the name of that land meant something painful and personal to her, he did not ask about it. Not then. He tipped his hat and walked back up the slope to look at his fencing, and Celia Ford looked at the creek for a moment before she picked up her trowel and went back to work. She did not tell Ada Hollies about the encounter. She turned it over in her mind that evening while she mended a collar by lamplight and tried to understand why it had unsettled her. Not in a bad way, in the way that something settling into place could feel unsettling when you had grown used to the ground shifting under you. The town learned about the new rancher quickly, the way towns learned everything. Within a week, Wallace Weston had been assessed, discussed, and categorized by most of Harrow Creek in the way that new arrivals were always categorized, with reference to what they might contribute, whether they were likely to stay, and what kind of man they appeared to be. The consensus was cautiously favorable. He paid his accounts on time. He was polite to the women and straightforward with the men, and did not appear to be carrying any outstanding warrants or unresolved bad habits, which was about as much as Harrow Creek asked of anyone before accepting them into the general community. Gerald Prout, the mayor, paid him a welcoming visit at the end of his first week, which was customary, and came away saying that Wallace Weston seemed like a solid addition to the community, and that it was good to have the Ford parcel being worked by someone who knew what he was doing. Denton Creel visited on the second week and spent an hour talking about the soil and the water rights, and the various local arrangements that had accumulated around the property over the years. And Wallace listened to all of it and thanked him and made no commitments about any of it, which Denton found mildly unsatisfying, but could not specifically object to. It was Denton Creel who first mentioned Celia to Wallace, not out of malice, but out of the casual, proprietary way that people in small towns discuss the people they have decided belong to the general narrative of a place. "You want to watch the creek access on the south boundary," Denton said, standing at the fence line with his thumbs in his vest pockets. "That Ford girl has been using the strip of land down there. I told her to stop when I sold, but she is not always reasonable about being told things." Wallace was looking at the fence post nearest him and testing it with one hand for stability. "Celia Ford," he said. "You know her." "We have spoken," Wallace said. Denton made a small sound that communicated volumes without being specific. "She is trouble, if I am honest. Good family once, but the apple fell far from the tree after her parents went. She had a situation at the hotel last fall that you may hear about. I would not extend any particular trust in that direction." Wallace drove the fence post deeper with the heel of his boot and moved to the next one. "What was the situation at the hotel?" Denton told him the version that had circulated in Harrow Creek. The drifter, the missing money, the fall. Wallace listened to all of it. When Denton finished, Wallace said, "And they found the drifter." Denton blinked. "Pardon." "Pryor, was that the name? The man who came through. They found him and confirmed what happened." Denton looked slightly uncomfortable. He moved on. These drifters always move on. "So no one confirmed whether the money was taken by him or by her?" "Well, Everett Baines concluded. Everett Baines was not in the room," Wallace said. He said it pleasantly, without accusation in his voice, the way you state a plain fact about the weather. "If no one witnessed it and the man was never found, seems like a lot of conclusion for not much evidence." Denton Creel opened his mouth and then closed it again. He was not a stupid man, and he recognized that the line of reasoning was sound, and that recognizing it made him feel slightly uncomfortable about things he had said and thought over the past 6 months regarding Celia Ford. But he was also a man who did not enjoy being uncomfortable, and so he redirected. "You are new here," Denton said, as if this were an argument. "You will understand how things work in time." "I expect I will," Wallace said agreeably, and moved to the next fence post. He started finding reasons to be near the creek in the early mornings, which he told himself was entirely about assessing the water source, and had nothing to do with the fact that Celia Ford tended her garden in the early mornings before she walked the 2 miles into town for her day's work. He was not the kind of man who lied to himself for long periods. By the second week, he admitted that it was at least partially about the garden, and by the third week, he admitted that it was mostly about her. They fell into a pattern of brief conversations that stretched, week by week, from a few exchanged words to longer exchanges that left him standing at the fence line longer than any water source assessment could reasonably justify. She was careful with him. She gave information in small, measured amounts, the way you give water to a plant that has been in drought, not all at once because too much at once can damage the roots. But she was not unfriendly. Underneath the composure she wore like a second skin, there was a sharpness and a humor, and an intelligence that surprised him every time it surfaced, not because he had not expected her to be intelligent, but because she had clearly stopped expecting anyone to notice. She made a dry remark one morning about the way the hill country soil would fight you until it decided to cooperate, and then it cooperated dramatically, which she said was its personality. He laughed genuinely, and she looked at him afterward with an expression that was not quite surprise but was close to it, as if the laugh had been louder than expected. "You have a sense of humor," she said. "I have been told it is too dry for most people," he said. "I prefer dry," she said. "Wet humor requires too much energy." They stood there for a moment longer than was strictly necessary, both looking at the creek, and then she picked up her basket and said she needed to get into town, and he watched her walk up the road and thought about how someone could be systematically invisible to an entire town and still be the most vivid person in a room or a field or anywhere else. He asked Ada Hollies about her. He chose Ada deliberately because Ada had known Celia the longest, and because there was something in Ada's manner when Celia's name came up in town conversation that was protective rather than dismissive, which told him Ada was someone who saw Celia clearly. He came into Ada's shop on the pretense of having a shirt collar repaired, which was a legitimate enough errand since the collar in question had been bothering him for 2 weeks, and when Ada had him settled with coffee and his shirt taken in for repair, he asked about Celia in the straightforward way he did most things. Ada looked at him for a long moment. She was a small woman in her mid-40s with sharp eyes and the kind of face that had learned to keep its own counsel over years of listening to other people's business. "Why are you asking me?" she said. "Because you are the only person in this town who seems to think well of her," Wallace said. Ada set her coffee cup down. "That is a perceptive thing to notice for a man who has been here 3 weeks. "I pay attention," he said. Ada studied him for another moment and then she told him. Not the version that circulated on the street, but the real version, the one she had watched from 3 feet away. The farm, the mortgage, Denton Creel and the bank. The hotel in Cole Pryor and Everett Baines. The Reverend and his private comment that had not stayed private. She told him about Margaret Ford, who had been a woman worth knowing, and about Hank Ford, who had been a decent man undone by illness. She told him about Celia at 12, standing in the churchyard at her father's funeral with her chin up and her hands folded, not crying because she was holding her mother up. When Ada finished, the shop was quiet for a moment. "She is not lost," Ada said. "I want to be very clear about that. The town has decided she is lost, and she has let them decide it because it is easier than fighting every person in Harrow Creek every single day. But she is not lost, she is just very tired." Wallace nodded. He turned his coffee cup in his hands. "She will not accept anything that looks like pity," Ada said, "and she will not accept anything that comes with conditions she cannot see clearly. She has been handed both of those things dressed up as kindness, and she has learned the difference." "I understand," he said. Ada gave him a long, measuring look. "I hope you do," she said, "because she deserves someone who actually does." He rode out to the South Road that evening thinking about everything Ada had said, and about the way Celia looked at the creek on the mornings they spoke, with a kind of longing that was not just for the water or the garden, but for something larger that she had learned not to name out loud. He thought about the farm that had been her parents' and was now his, and about the way her expression had closed briefly when he said the name of it. He thought about all of this for a long time, and then he stopped thinking about it and started doing something about it instead, which was how he approached most things. The idea came to him slowly and then all at once. He needed help on the ranch. That was a genuine and pressing practical need. The 40 acres were in reasonable shape, but there was fence work and planting, and the kind of continuous labor that one man could not do alone indefinitely. He had been thinking about hiring a hand from town, a young man to help with the heavy work. But there was also bookkeeping to be done, accounts to be kept, supply lists to be managed, the organizational side of running a working farm that took a certain kind of careful, intelligent attention. He walked into Ada Hollies' shop the following Monday and asked if Celia Ford had any experience with farm accounts and record-keeping. Ada raised her eyebrows. She helped her mother run the Ford farm from the time she was 16, Ada said. She can read and write and cipher better than most of the men on the town council. Why? I need someone to manage the books for the ranch, Wallace said. 2 days a week, maybe 3. Fair pay, legitimate work. No conditions attached that are not in plain writing. Ada looked at him for a very long time. You are going to ask her yourself, she said. I am not your go-between. I intend to, he said. I wanted to know if she was capable first, before I put the offer to her in a way that was worth her time. Ada's expression softened slightly, the way a tight thing softens when it recognizes sincerity. She is more than capable, she said. She is the most capable person I know. He found Celia at the garden the next morning and asked her directly and honestly, the way he did everything. He told her what he needed, what he was offering to pay, what the work involved, and that there were no expectations attached to the position beyond the position itself. He looked at her while he said it so she could read his face and confirm that he meant what he said. She was quiet for a moment. He could see her running through the offer the way she would run through a row of beans, checking each one. Why me? She asked. Because Ada says you are the most capable person she knows, he said, and Ada is not a person who says things she does not mean. Something in Celia's face shifted. Ada is generous. Ada is honest, Wallace said. There is a difference. She looked at the creek for a moment, then she looked back at him. 2 days a week, she said. Wednesdays and Saturdays. I will want to see the accounts in full before I agree to organize them so I understand what I am working with. That is completely reasonable, he said. And if I find the accounts are in such disorder that they require more than 2 days to sort, I will tell you plainly, and we will agree to a revised arrangement before I do the additional work. Also reasonable, he said. She was watching him with that careful, measuring look that he had come to recognize as her way of testing whether a thing was real. You are very agreeable, she said, and it was not quite a compliment and not quite a suspicion. I am asking you to do work I genuinely need done, he said. There is nothing to disagree about. She started on the following Wednesday, and the account books were indeed in the kind of creative disorder that a man who had spent 6 years on cattle drives, and not 6 years managing a farm, could be expected to maintain, which is to say they were a mixture of genuine record-keeping instincts and significant organizational chaos. She spent the first Wednesday afternoon bringing order to 3 months of receipts and making a ledger structure that made sense, and when she left she told him plainly that the accounts were manageable but would require a 3rd day for the first 2 weeks to get them current. I told you I would say so, she said, at the door. You did, he said. I appreciate it. She walked back to town in the early evening light and felt something she had almost forgotten the texture of, which was the particular satisfaction of work that used the full range of what she was capable of. She turned it over carefully, not wanting to attach too much meaning to it. She was being paid for a service. It was a practical arrangement. She told herself this for approximately 4 days before she admitted that she had thought about Wallace Weston, considerably more than a purely practical arrangement warranted. He was not what she expected a rancher to be, or rather he was exactly what a rancher should be but was not always. A man who did what he said and said what he meant, who did not perform generosity for the benefit of being seen doing it, who treated her accounts the same way he treated his fence posts, as things that needed to be done correctly and were worth the time to do correctly. He was direct without being blunt, and quiet without being cold, and when he looked at her, It was with the kind of attention that registered her as a full person, and not a problem to be managed or a background figure in someone else's story. She found herself talking more. It happened gradually, the way seasons changed in the hill country, not dramatically but definitively. On the third Wednesday, she mentioned her father and the soil quality he had always maintained on the South Road, and she watched Wallace listen to this with genuine interest and ask about which fields had produced best, and she found herself describing the planting rotations her father had used, and then her mother's kitchen garden, and then she stopped, because she had been talking for several minutes without measuring the words, and that was not something she had done in a very long time. Wallace said, "The field nearest the creek on the east side, your father rotated beans into that ground. Every other year," she said. "He said the soil needed the nitrogen." "He was right," Wallace said. "I can see it in the quality of the dirt compared to the west field. I have been trying to figure out why the east comes up better." She looked at him. "You should plant beans there again this year." "I intend to," he said. "Thank you." She walked home that evening feeling something warm and alarming moving in her chest that she tried to identify as professional satisfaction, and could not quite convince herself it was. The town noticed she was working at the Weston Ranch. Of course it did. Harrow Creek noticed everything. The observation traveled from Leonard Fitch's general store to Denton Creel's feed store to Gerald Pruitt's porch within approximately 48 hours of Celia's first Wednesday at the ranch, and the commentary it generated was the kind of commentary that said more about the people generating it than about the thing being observed. Several women in town expressed concern, in the pointed way that expressed concern was understood by everyone to mean something else, that it was not proper for an unmarried woman of questionable reputation to be spending time alone at a bachelor rancher's property. Reverend Hobart mentioned something in a Sunday sermon about the importance of propriety in all arrangements, which was general enough to be deniable but specific enough that Ada Hollies, sitting 3 rows from the front, felt her jaw tighten. Denton Creel took it upon himself to visit Wallace again, this time less to discuss soil and more to communicate, in the roundabout way that men in positions of town influence communicated these things, that employing Celia Ford might create social complications for a new arrival who was still establishing himself in the community. Wallace listened to all of it with the same attentive patience he brought to everything. When Denton finished, Wallace said, "Miss Ford does excellent work. Her account-keeping is the clearest I have seen from anyone who has offered to manage my records, and I have had 2 other offers since arriving in Harrow Creek, from men who came out here specifically to pitch for the work. She is more organized and more thorough than either of them." Denton blinked. "That may be but the perception. I keep accounts with people who do the work well," Wallace said. "If the town has a concern about that, I am happy to hear it directly. But I will not make decisions about my business based on someone's reputation that does not appear to be founded on anything I can verify." Denton left shortly after, and Wallace went back to mending the section of fence along the north boundary, and felt something that was equal parts satisfaction at having said what needed saying and concern for what it might cost Celia if the town decided to make her position more difficult. He mentioned it to her on the following Wednesday. Not in a manner that was alarming, but in the manner of someone sharing relevant information with a person who deserved to have it. Celia was quiet for a moment after he told her. She was looking at the ledger page in front of her, and her expression was the careful, composed mask she wore when something was touching a place that was already bruised. "I am aware of what the town says," she said. "I know you are," he said. "I want you to know that it does not change anything on my end, but I thought you should have the information rather than not have it." She looked up at him. "Denton Creel came to warn you off from employing me. He suggested it was socially complicated," Wallace said. "And what did you say?" "I said you do excellent work and I make decisions based on what I can verify." She looked at him for a long moment, and he could see something moving behind her eyes, something complicated that she was sorting through, and he waited for her to sort it because he had learned that she needed the space to arrive at things in her own time. "No one has said that before," she said, "that they make decisions based on what they can verify. Every person who has spoken about me in this town has been speaking about a version of me that they decided on without verification." "I noticed," he said. "It makes me wonder what you would find if you verified," she said, and there was a vulnerability in it that she was clearly aware of, and that cost her something to leave visible. "I find someone who tends a garden with more care than most people give to anything," he said, "and who runs a set of accounts with more clarity than anyone I have met, and who has more patience for being treated poorly by people who should know better than I would have if our situations were reversed." The color that came into her face was unexpected and brief and genuine. She looked back at the ledger. "You should not say things like that," she said. "Why not?" "Because it is difficult to know what to do with them." He was quiet for a moment. "You could just accept them," he said. "You do not have to do anything with them." She did not respond to that. But she did not argue with it either, and Wallace thought that was probably as close to acceptance as she was ready to get at that particular moment, and that was fine. He was a patient man. The spring moved toward summer. The east field went in with beans as Celia had suggested, and the west field with sorghum, and Wallace hired a young man named Tobias Reyes, the 17-year-old son of a Mexican family who ran a small, spread 2 miles north of the South Road, to help with the heavy fence work and the planting. Tobias was a good worker, quiet and strong, and he treated Celia with the natural respect of someone who had been raised to treat people decently, which was refreshing in its simplicity. The three of them fell into a comfortable rhythm on the days Celia was at the ranch. She worked the books in the front room of the small ranch house while Wallace and Tobias worked the land, and in the evenings when the day's work was done, she sometimes sat on the porch while Wallace walked the fence line that was visible from the house, and they would talk across the quiet evening, not always about anything important, sometimes about the crops, sometimes about the weather, sometimes about things that were further away from practicality and closer to the kinds of things you said to someone when you were beginning to understand that you wanted to say more than practical things. He told her about the trail drives, about the Kisham route, which he had ridden 3 times, and about the Red River crossing, which was the worst part of every drive, the water high and the cattle terrified, and the whole outfit relying on the lead steer to show the rest of the herd that the far bank existed and was worth swimming toward. He told her about the men he had ridden with, a collection of individuals as varied as any sample of humanity, some brave, some cowardly, most somewhere in the complicated middle. He told her about the night skies on the open prairie, which were the most spectacular thing he had seen in his life, so full of stars that the darkness between them seemed almost incidental. She told him about her mother. She had not told anyone about Margaret Ford in months because no one had asked, and she had grown accustomed to keeping her parents as a private thing, not to be exposed to the town's casual commentary. But she told Wallace about Margaret's garden and her specific philosophy of planting, which was that you put things in the ground on faith, and then you made good on the faith with labor, and that the faith and the labor were both necessary and neither was sufficient alone. She told him about her father's habit of singing while he worked, not well, never well, but with great commitment, and she smiled when she said it, a real smile that moved through her whole face, and Wallace thought it was the best thing he had seen since he had arrived in Harrow Creek. "You should do that more," he said. "Sing," she said. "Smile," he said. She looked at him, and the color came back into her face, and she looked away quickly, toward the east field where the bean plants were coming in, and she said something about the progress of the crops that was entirely sensible and not at all related to what he had said, and Wallace let her redirect, because the moment was real enough that he did not want to push past it before it had time to settle. The crisis, when it came, was the kind of crisis that small towns specialized in, not dramatic in itself, but devastating in its social mechanics. It was a Saturday morning in late June, and Celia had come out to the ranch for her regular account work. She had been there about 2 hours and had stepped out to the porch for a moment of air when Reverend Hobart came up the South Road with two deacon wives named Martha Greer and Patience Willows, who had apparently decided that a pastoral visit was in order to address the ongoing impropriety of the arrangement. Reverend Hobart was a tall, thin man with pale eyes and the kind of religious authority that had never been seriously challenged, and had therefore never developed the resilience that genuine challenge produces. He stood at the fence gate with Martha Greer and Patience Willows, flanking him like the stone pillars at the church door, and addressed Celia on the porch in the voice he used for sinners, which was modulated to carry the maximum amount of concern while minimizing the appearance of judgment. He said that the community had grown worried about the situation here at the South Road property. He said that an unmarried woman spending time regularly at a bachelor's home was a source of concern and of talk that was not good for anyone, and that it would be best for all parties if the arrangement were ended, and Celia returned to the kinds of employment more suitable to her circumstances. Celia stood on the porch and looked at him with the composed expression she wore like armor, and Wallace, who had come around the side of the house from the water pump and heard most of this, stood by the corner of the porch and said nothing yet, wanting to hear how she chose to respond. She said, in a voice that was very steady, "Reverend Hobart, I am employed here as a record keeper. My work is done in full view of anyone who cares to look, in the front room of this house with the door open to the porch. I am paid a fair wage for work that I perform competently. If the nature of that employment is a source of concern to the community, I would suggest that the concern is misplaced." Reverend Hobart said that the appearance of the thing was the problem regardless of the reality of it, and it was then that Wallace stepped forward. He came off the corner of the porch and stood at the top of the porch steps, and his voice was entirely calm when he spoke, which somehow made it more significant than if he had been angry. "Reverend Hobart," he said, "I have been in this town for 11 weeks. In that time I have paid my accounts, contributed to the community, hired local workers, and conducted my business honestly. I have found Miss Ford to be an honest and capable professional who has done good work for my ranch. The employment arrangement is legitimate, the compensation is fair, and there is nothing about it that warrants a pastoral visit from 3 people who have not been invited here." Reverend Hobart's pale eyes fixed on him. "Mr. Weston, I understand you are new here and do not know the full history." "I know more than you think I know," Wallace said. "I know about the hotel incident, and I know about the manner in which the story was told afterward. I know about a drifter named Cole Pryor who was never found and never charged. I know about the mortgage and the farm. And I know that this woman standing behind me has been treated poorly by this community for a long time and has conducted herself with considerably more dignity throughout it than the community has shown her." Martha Greer made a small, sharp sound. Patience Willows looked at the fence post. Reverend Hobart said, with some heat now in his voice, "You are making a mistake in taking up her cause." "I am not taking up her cause," Wallace said. "I am employing someone who does good work, and I am asking you to leave my property." There was a long silence. Reverend Hobart looked at him. He looked at Celia. He appeared to be calculating something and finding the calculation unsatisfactory. Then he turned and walked back down the South Road, and Martha Greer and Patience Willows followed him, and the dust of their departure settled in the morning air. Wallace turned and found Celia looking at him with an expression he had not seen on her face before. It was not the careful, measured look. It was something unguarded and raw, and her eyes were bright in a way that was not quite tears but was close enough to them. "You should not have done that," she said. "I know," he said. "They will make things difficult for you." "They might," he said. "I have lived through difficult before." She looked at him for a long moment. "Why?" she said, and the word carried everything. Not just why did you defend me, but why do you care? Why are you real when I have stopped expecting real things? Wallace came down one porch step so he was closer to her level. "Because it needed saying," he said, "and because I meant every word of it." She did not move. She was looking at him with the full weight of everything she had been carrying for 2 years, and the careful composure had slipped enough that he could see the woman behind it clearly. She was extraordinary. She was tired and brave and angry and hopeful in a way that refused to die even under the weight of all the reasons she had been given to let it die, and he was looking at her with everything he felt showing on his face because he had never been good at hiding what he actually thought. "Celia," he said, "do not say something that you will have to take back," she said, and her voice was quiet and very serious. "I have not said anything I intend to take back," he said. "I meant it when I told Leonard Fitch 2 months ago that your situation at the hotel was not verified. I meant it when I told Denton Creel that I make decisions based on evidence. And I mean it right now when I tell you that I think you are the finest person in this county, and that whatever the town of Harrow Creek has decided about you is wrong in every particular." The brightness in her eyes became more definite. She blinked it back. "You are going to make this very complicated," she said. "I expect so," he said. "Are you all right with that?" She looked at him for a long, searching moment, and he could see her weighing it, all of it, the risk and the cost and the history of what happened when she trusted something that seemed real. He watched her arrive at the decision. He watched it happen in her eyes. "I might be," she said. "Ask me again in a week." He smiled at that, a full, unreserved smile, and she looked at it with something like wonder. "All right," he said. "1 week." She went back inside to finish the accounts, and he went back to the fence line, and the South Road sat quiet in the summer heat as if the entire morning had been perfectly ordinary. The following week in Harrow Creek was not entirely comfortable. Reverend Hobart's visit to the South Road became known, as all things became known, and the reaction was divided in the particular way that Harrow Creek was always divided, between the people who concluded that Wallace Weston had been rude and overstepping, and the people who were privately beginning to reassess the story of Celia Ford now that someone had said plainly in her presence that the story did not hold up. Ada Hollies, for her part, heard the account from Celia that Saturday evening and sat with it for a moment, and then said, with great satisfaction, that it was about time. Gerald Prout, the mayor, visited Wallace on Monday with the diplomatic discomfort of a man who knew something needed to be said and was not sure which version of the thing to say. He sat on the porch with his hat in his hands and told Wallace that he understood his position and that he personally had never fully believed the hotel story, but that community harmony was a delicate thing and so on. Wallace listened to this with patience and then said, "Mayor Prout, did Celia Ford ever ask you for help? When she came to you about the mortgage situation?" Prout's round face colored slightly. "She did come by my office, yes. And you suggested she take domestic work." "I thought it was the practical. She is capable of running a set of accounts better than most of the merchants in this town," Wallace said. "She runs the books for my ranch with more clarity and competence than the business is going to deserve for another year or two. If someone had offered her legitimate skilled work instead of domestic service, she would have taken it, and the whole subsequent history of the last 2 years would have looked different." Prout was quiet for a moment. "Perhaps," he said. "Not perhaps," Wallace said. "Definitely." Prout looked at his hat. "She is a proud girl." "She is a capable woman," Wallace said. "Proud is what you call it when someone refuses to be treated as less than they are." Prout left without saying much else, and Wallace was not entirely sure what the visit had accomplished, except that Prout was a man who thought about things after the fact, and sometimes that was enough. The week passed, and the Saturday came, and Celia arrived at the ranch as she always did, and the morning passed with the comfortable routine of accounts and quiet conversation and Tobias working the east field. In the late morning, Wallace brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch and handed her one, and they sat for a moment in the particular quiet of the hill country summer morning. "You said to ask you again in a week," he said. She looked at her coffee. The edge of her mouth moved. "I did say that." "Well," he said, "I am asking." She turned and looked at him, and this time the look was different. It was the direct, clear look of someone who had made a decision and was not going to qualify it with excessive caution. "I find that I am more than all right with it," she said. "With whatever this is, whatever it becomes." She paused. "I have not said that to anyone in a very long time. That I am all right with something becoming what it is." "I know," he said. "It is frightening," she said. "Yes," he said. "You are frightening," she said, but the way she said it was not afraid. "I do not mean to be," he said. "You are not frightening in the way that threatens," she said. "You are frightening in the way that matters. The way things are frightening when you want them to be real." He set his coffee cup down on the porch railing and looked at her with everything he had been carrying since the morning he saw her walk into Leonard Fitch's store and take off her bonnet and assess the shelves with those clear brown eyes. "I want it to be real," he said, "very much." She set her own cup down. "Then let us be careful with it," she said, "and let us be honest about it every step." "Those are my two preferred conditions," he said. "I know," she said. "That is why I said them." He reached across the space between them and covered her hand with his, just that, just his hand over hers on the porch railing. She looked at their hands for a moment, and then she turned hers over and held his, and the hill country morning went on around them, warm and full of birds and the smell of the east field coming into its summer season. What followed was a courtship conducted in the full view of a town that had decidedly mixed feelings about it, which was, in a strange way, one of the most clarifying things that had happened to Harrow Creek in years. Wallace was not discreet about his intentions. He was not the kind of man who courted quietly when he had nothing to be ashamed of, and he had nothing to be ashamed of. He walked with Celia from the South Road into town on Saturday evenings. He sat beside her at church, which caused Reverend Hobart a visible internal conflict between his pastoral instinct to welcome all parishioners and his personal instinct to register disapproval. He bought her coffee at the small counter at the back of Leonard Fitch's store when they came in together for supplies. He escorted her to the Independence Day social in July, which was the most public possible statement a man could make in Harrow Creek about his intentions, and he danced with her twice, which was noticed by everyone present. Some people received this with open disapproval. The Greer family and the Willows family, and a few others of Reverend Hobart's closer circle, made their feelings known through the precise social mechanics of not speaking to Celia when Wallace was present, which was meant to communicate something important, but mostly communicated that they had decided to feel strongly about something they could not practically prevent. But something else was also happening. Something more interesting. There was a woman named Ruth Calder, the wife of the blacksmith, who had been in the group that had murmured about Celia after the hotel incident. Ruth Calder was not a bad woman. She was a woman who had followed the social current of the town because the social current was strong, and she had never thought carefully about what lay underneath it. Watching Wallace Weston stand on his porch and state plainly that the hotel story did not hold up had done something to Ruth Calder that she would later describe to her husband as feeling like a window being opened in a room she had not realized was stuffy. Ruth Calder was the first one. She came into Ada Hollies' shop in the second week of July, while Celia was there picking up a mended skirt, and she stood for a moment with her hands clasped, and then she said, looking directly at Celia, that she owed her an apology for believing something she should have questioned more carefully. She said it plainly and without excessive ornamentation, and it clearly cost her something, and she did not try to soften the cost with qualifications. Celia looked at her for a moment. Ada held very still behind her counter. "Thank you," Celia said. "I appreciate that." It was not an effusive forgiveness, but it was a real one. And Ruth Calder left the shop with the particular lightness of someone who has put down a thing they had been carrying without acknowledging the weight of it. Ruth was not the last. Over the following weeks, in ones and twos, several people in Harrow Creek arrived at small, quiet reckonings with the way they had handled Celia Ford. Not everyone, not even most, but enough to shift the temperature of the town, to open a few more of those windows, to create a space in which Celia Ford could walk down the main street without feeling the accumulated weight of collective judgment pressing down on her from every storefront. Everett Baines, the hotel owner, was not among those who arrived at a reckoning. He maintained, in the particular stubbornness of a man who has built an identity around being right about things, that his conclusion had been the correct one given the information available to him at the time. Wallace found this unsatisfying but not surprising. Some people chose the comfort of their wrong conclusions over the discomfort of revising them, and that was a thing you could observe and document, and not much more. What mattered more was what was happening on the South Road, where the East Field was producing beans in the quantity and quality that Hank Ford's rotation philosophy had always promised, and where the ranch house was slowly becoming a home in the way that a house becomes a home when it has a woman walking through it with opinions about where the light comes in and how the kitchen should be organized. Celia had not moved in. That was not the nature of the arrangement. But she had brought a small clay pot with a rosemary plant in it that she set on the kitchen windowsill, and she had reorganized the supply shelf in a way that made everything findable. And she had a particular way of walking through the front room to the porch that had made it feel occupied and loved in a way it had not been before. And Wallace noticed all of this with a warmth that was becoming impossible to contain in the space of a carefully managed courtship. He asked her to marry him on a Thursday evening in August, at the creek, standing beside the kitchen garden that had started all of this. He had a ring that had been his mother's, a simple gold band with a small garnet that she had worn until the day she died, and that he had carried in his shirt pocket for the entire trip from east of San Antonio because he had known, in the way that he knew things about weather and soil and the character of the river at crossing time, that the right moment would come. He got down on one knee, which was not what he had planned but seemed right when the moment arrived. The evening light was coming through the creek cottonwoods, and Celia was standing at the garden's edge in a blue dress that Ada had helped her alter, looking at the water with the expression she wore when she was thinking about something she had not yet put words to. "Celia," he said. She turned and looked at him, on his knee in the creek grass, and her expression went through several things very quickly. "I have been thinking about how to say this properly," he said, "and I have decided that the proper way is plainly. I love you. I have loved you since approximately the second morning we talked at this fence line, and you told me the hill country soil cooperated dramatically once it decided to cooperate. I want to marry you. I want to build a life with you on this land, which your father worked and your mother tended, and which I bought without knowing any of that, but which I think was always meant to come back to you in some form. I want to be the person who looks at you every day and sees what is actually there, for as long as you will let me." She was very still. The creek ran past them quietly. A bird was doing something urgent in the cottonwoods. "That land is yours," she said, and her voice was not entirely steady. "I know," he said. "I am not offering it back. I am offering you something better than land. I am offering you a home." Her eyes were bright and full, and she was doing nothing to manage them. "That was a very good thing to say," she said. "I meant it," he said. "I know," she said. "That is what makes it very good." She stepped forward and took his face in her hands, and she said, with the full warmth and the humor and the deep, honest heart that the town of Harrow Creek had decided was lost and was not lost at all, was never lost, was just waiting for someone who meant what he said. "Yes, Wallace. Yes. I will absolutely marry you." He stood, and she put her arms around him, and he held her in the August evening at the creek where her garden grew, and the land all around them was warm and quiet, and full of the particular piece of things arriving where they were always going. They told Ada Holly's first, which was right and proper. Ada made a sound that was not quite a cry and not quite a laugh and was both at the same time, and she held Celia's face in her small hands and said she was very, very glad. She looked at Wallace over Celia's shoulder and nodded once with the gravity of someone transferring a trust, and he met that nod with the gravity it deserved. Gerald Prout came to offer his congratulations in person, which surprised Wallace slightly, and which he suspected represented some form of the reckoning that the town was slowly, imperfectly conducting with itself. Prut was awkward about it but genuine, which was perhaps the best one could ask. He shook Wallace's hand and said he hoped they would be happy, and then said, almost in an afterthought, looking somewhere over Celia's left shoulder, that he thought he might have handled some things differently 2 years ago, and that he was sorry for it. Celia said thank you, again plainly and without excess, and Prut looked relieved in the way of a man who has expected punishment and received something more complicated and more merciful than punishment. The wedding was held on the 15th of September, 1883, on a Saturday, at the church in Harrow Creek. Reverend Hobart officiated, which was a thing Wallace had considered carefully, and Celia had recommended on the grounds that making him perform the ceremony was a neater resolution than seeking a minister from Mason, and also on the grounds that Reverend Hobart, beneath all of his community instincts and his failed pastoral conclusions, was a man with a real faith that he sometimes administered badly, and that real faith deserved the chance to administer itself well. Reverend Hobart performed the ceremony with genuine solemnity and without editorial comment, which was perhaps the most gracious thing he had ever done, and which Ada Hollis noted approvingly from the front pew where she sat with her handkerchief already in use. Tobias Reyes came to the wedding with his family, his parents and 2 younger sisters, and his mother cried at the appropriate moments with the generous emotional response of a woman who considered all love worth celebrating. Tobias stood straight and proud as one of the witnesses, his handwriting on the marriage certificate careful and clear. Leonard Fitch came and stood near the back and looked thoughtful throughout. Ruth Calder came with her husband the blacksmith and sat in the middle rows and wept openly at the vows, which she would later tell people was the best crying she had done in years. Celia wore a dress she and Ada had made together over the preceding 3 weeks, ivory cotton with a small trim of lace at the collar and sleeves, and she had flowers from her garden in her hair, small yellow things that Ada knew the name of, and Wallace did not, but that Celia had grown from seed. She came down the aisle of the church on Ada's arm, because she had no family left to bring her down it, and she walked with the straight back and the lifted chin that had been her inheritance from Margaret Ford, and her eyes were on Wallace at the front of the church, and Wallace's eyes were on her, and the look that passed between them was so private and complete that several people in the pews felt they had seen something they ought not to have been there for. Not because it was improper, but because it was so entirely genuine. The vows were the traditional ones from the Book of Common Prayer, the ones that had been said in English churches and American frontier churches for generations, the promises about honor and love and the particular commitment of staying, which was the hardest and most important promise. When Reverend Hobart asked Wallace if he would have Celia love her, comfort her, honor and keep her, and Wallace said, "I will," his voice was steady and clear, the voice of a man who had considered what the words meant and intended every one of them. When Reverend Hobart asked Celia the same, and she said, "I will," her voice was equally steady, and the word "will" carried inside it everything she had come through to get here, every lost year and every written-off morning and everything the town had decided without asking her. And the word meant not only that she would, but that she could, that she was capable of it, that she had survived the wilderness of the past 2 years intact enough to stand here and choose this with her full self. Wallace put his mother's garnet ring on her finger, and it sat there as if it had been made for her hand, which was the kind of thing that happened sometimes when the right things found each other. They walked out of the church into the September afternoon, and the air was warm, and the sky was the particular shade of blue that the Texas hill country produced in that season, deep and clear and very large. And Celia stood on the church steps with the sun on her face and her hand in Wallace's, and the whole town of Harrow Creek more or less arranged around them. And she looked at her husband with an expression that was so open and so full that Ada had to press her handkerchief to her eyes again. The celebration afterward was held in the churchyard, long tables brought out, food contributed by various members of the community in the way of Western community gatherings, where even people who had held complicated positions found themselves present and contributing because the fact of two people choosing to build something together was a thing that was difficult to be entirely opposed to. Someone produced a fiddle, someone else had a guitar. Tobias Reyes turned out to be an unexpectedly accomplished dancer and went through 3 partners before the evening was over. Ada Hollis sat at the table nearest the food and accepted congratulations as if she had personally arranged the whole thing, which was close enough to the truth. Wallace danced with Celia twice, which was what he had done at the July 4th social, and she laughed this time in a way that she had not laughed there, freely and without measuring the sound, and he spun her out and brought her back, and she came back to him with an ease that was the ease of someone who had found the center of something and recognized it. They rode home to the South Road property as the stars came out, and the South Road was silver in the moonlight, and the East Field was dark and fragrant and full of growing things, and the ranch house was lit from inside with the warm light of the lamps that Tobias had lit before he left for the evening as a kindness, and it sat there at the end of the road like a thing that had been waiting for them to arrive. Celia stood at the gate for a moment looking at it. "It looks like a home," she said. "It is," Wallace said. She squeezed his hand and they went through the gate together, and the South Road night settled around the property with the long, rich quiet of a Texas September. The first year of the marriage was a year of building. Not dramatically, not in the way of stories that required great difficulty in their early seasons, but in the way that real things were built, daily and incrementally, and with a great deal of attention to getting the foundations right. Celia took over the full management of the ranch accounts, which freed Wallace to focus on the land and the livestock, and she expanded the kitchen garden into a full productive enterprise that, by the following spring, was producing enough to sell the surplus at the general store. Leonard Fitch, who had watched the courtship and the wedding and done his own private accounting of his behavior over the past year, was scrupulously fair in what he paid for the produce, which Celia accepted with the same equanimity she applied to everything, noting it and moving on. The ranch grew. Wallace purchased 4 additional head of cattle in the spring of 1884, and Tobias Reyes came on as a full-time hand when it became clear the operation needed him permanently. His wages were fair, and Wallace made sure of it, and Tobias's father rode out one Sunday afternoon to thank Wallace in person in a quiet, serious way that Wallace received with equal seriousness, understanding what it meant in a country where Mexican families who worked the land were not always treated with the fairness their labor earned. The East Field produced well for the 2nd year running. The beans went in at the right time, and the rotation held, and the yield was better than anything the soil had produced in recent memory, according to Tobias, who had watched this stretch of hill country land since he was a boy. Wallace told him about Hank Ford's rotation philosophy, which Celia had told him, and Tobias nodded and said that Hank Ford had understood the land, which was the highest compliment he knew to give. In the town of Harrow Creek, things continued their slow and imperfect evolution. Reverend Hobart never specifically recanted his original assessment of Celia Ford, but he also never repeated it, and his sermons in the year following the wedding were notably more careful in their application of general spiritual principles to specific community members, which Ada Hollis considered an adequate outcome, if not a perfect one. Denton Creel remained a man who had done what he had done and was not inclined to examine it too closely. He and Wallace maintained a civil, commercial relationship that never became warm but never became hostile, which was the kind of resolution that was achievable if not ideal. Everett Baines sold the hotel in the spring of 1884 to a couple from Mason and left Harrow Creek for reasons that were never fully explained, but that several people privately connected to the cumulative social discomfort of being the last person in town who still publicly maintained that Celia Ford had been a thief. This was not a dramatic exile. It was simply a man who found his position increasingly untenable and chose to relocate rather than revise, which was his right and also, quietly, a form of justice. Ruth Calder became something close to a friend to Celia over the course of that first year. It was not the friendship Celia had with Ada, which was deep and long and tested. It was a newer thing, a carefully tended thing, built on the foundation of a real apology and a genuine attempt to know the person rather than the reputation. Ruth's husband, the blacksmith, was a good man who had always been uncertain about the Celia Ford story but had not said so, and he found Wallace to be the kind of neighbor who made the community feel more solid, which was not an insignificant thing in a frontier town where the quality of your neighbors was one of the most important variables in survival. By the autumn of 1884, Celia knew she was expecting. She told Wallace on an October evening, sitting on the porch in the way they often sat in the evenings, with the day's work done and the land quiet around them. She had waited 3 days to be certain before she said anything, and when she told him, she watched his face go through several things at once and arrive at an expression that she would carry with her for the rest of her life, an expression of such complete and unguarded joy that it seemed to come from somewhere deeper than ordinary happiness. He came across the porch and sat beside her and took her hand and said, "Are you well? Are you feeling well?" "I am," she said. "I am quite well." "A baby," he said, as if the word needed saying out loud to be real. "A baby," she agreed. He put his arms around her and she leaned into him, and the South Road evening went on around them, and the kitchen garden was putting out the last of the season's rosemary in the cool air, and the east field was ready for fall, and the house behind them had 3 rooms and a good solid roof, and 2 people in it who had built something real enough to last. Ada Hollis received the news with the same combination of emotional extravagance and practical competence that characterized her response to all of Celia's important moments. She immediately began planning what she would sew for the baby and what she knew about the nearest reliable midwife, and what Celia should be eating more of and less of, which she delivered in the form of a long, affectionate lecture that Celia received with deep amusement and genuine gratitude. The winter of 1884 passed in the way of hill country winters, with cold that was not brutal but was honest, with clear days and hard frosts, and the particular beauty of the cedar and live oak country in its winter colors. Wallace made modifications to the house in preparation, a proper second bedroom added onto the back, which he and Tobias built together over a period of 6 weeks with wood from Mason, and a good deal of mutual instruction, Tobias's carpentry being better than Wallace's and Wallace contributing the structural instinct that came from years of building cattle facilities that had to withstand weather. The baby came in the last days of May, 1885, which was a warm and gentle month to arrive in. The midwife, a competent and steady woman named Mrs. Harker from 2 miles north, was present through the labor and delivery, and Ada Hollis sat in the front room and pretended to occupy herself with mending, while she actually listened to every sound from the back room with the focused anxiety of someone who would not relax until she had confirmation that all was well. It was a boy. Wallace heard the first cry and felt something shift in the geography of his chest that he had not anticipated and would not subsequently be able to describe in words that were adequate to it. He was allowed in shortly after, and Celia lay in the bed with the baby against her and looked up at Wallace with a tiredness that was so complete it had passed through the far side of exhaustion and come out the other side into something luminous. "He is healthy," Mrs. Harker said. "Good strong lungs, as I believe you all heard." "We heard," Ada said from the doorway, her handkerchief in full deployment. Wallace sat on the edge of the bed and looked at his son. The baby was red and wrinkled and furious about the world in the way of all new arrivals, and he was the most extraordinary thing Wallace had ever seen. "What shall we call him?" Celia asked. They had discussed names. They had a list. Looking at the baby now, Wallace found that only one name on the list felt right. "Henry," he said, "for your father." Celia looked at him, and the luminous tiredness in her face became something else, something that was one of the most complete and real things she had ever felt. She looked at the baby. "Henry Ford Weston," she said. "Henry." The name sat in the room with the rightness of things that fit exactly where they belong. "Is that all right?" Wallace asked. "It is more than all right," she said. "It is exactly right." Ada made a sound behind her handkerchief that confirmed everyone present that she was deeply satisfied with all outcomes, and Mrs. Harker gathered her things with the professional contentment of a midwife whose job had gone well. And the late May afternoon outside the window of the South Road Ranch house was full of everything growing. The kitchen garden and the east field and the cedar breaks and the long hill country sky. And Henry Ford Weston announced his presence in it with another full-throated cry that made his father laugh with a joy so deep it sounded like it came from somewhere geological. In the months that followed, the rhythm of the ranch took on a new register. Henry was a vigorous and demanding baby who slept in enthusiastic bursts and woke with strong opinions about the world, which Wallace found he agreed with philosophically. Celia managed the accounts, and the baby, and the garden with the same organized competence she brought to everything, and Wallace watched her be a mother with the same wonder with which he watched the East Field produce, the confirmation of something always known but still astonishing to see. Tobias Reyes, now 20, had become so thoroughly a part of the South Road operation that it was impossible to imagine the ranch without him. He took his work seriously and had begun putting money aside with the intention, which he told Wallace about carefully one evening, of eventually buying a small piece of land of his own. Wallace told him that he could have the creek access strip when the time came at a fair price, because it bordered the Reyes family property, and it was the right thing to do, and Tobias sat with that for a moment, and said quietly that he appreciated it more than he could say. They shook on it with the seriousness of men who did not make promises they did not intend to keep. 2 years after Henry's arrival, in the summer of 1887, Celia told Wallace she was expecting again. This second pregnancy was easier than the first, or perhaps she simply knew better what to expect, and she moved through it with the competence of someone who had done the work before and knew its rhythms. Wallace hovered somewhat more than was necessary, and she told him so with complete affection, and he acknowledged the point and continued to hover at a slightly reduced rate. Their second child was a daughter, born in February of 1888, delivered again by Mrs. Harker with Ada present, and Tobias managing the ranch through the event with practiced calm. They named her Margaret for Celia's mother, and Wallace thought this was exactly right. And Margaret Ford Weston arrived in the hill country winter with the same strong lungs as her brother and the same dark eyes as her mother. And the ranch house that had once been an empty purchase property was now so full of life that the walls seemed to breathe. Henry, who was nearly 3 when Margaret arrived, approached his sister with the combination of curiosity and suspicion common to small humans presented with a new sibling, and settled within 2 weeks into a proprietary affection that involved following her everywhere she could not yet go and reporting back on things she would need to know about. The town of Harrow Creek had, by 1888, resolved itself into a place that Celia Ford Weston moved through with the full dignity that had always been hers, and that the town had now largely accepted, some out of genuine recalibration, some out of social pressure, and some simply because the passage of time and the evidence of a decent life well lived was harder to argue against than a story told once in 1882 about a drifter and a hotel till. Reverend Hobart retired in 1887 and was replaced by a younger minister named Thomas Clay, who had been sent from the Methodist Conference in Austin, and who had the particular quality of being both genuinely devout and genuinely humble, which was a combination the community had needed for some time and received with various degrees of gratitude. Thomas Clay made a point of visiting all the families in the congregation and arrived at the South Road Ranch on a Thursday afternoon to find Celia managing Henry, a basket of accounts, and a pot of soup on the stove simultaneously, and left with a very clear impression of the kind of woman she was, which was the impression Celia always left when people actually looked. Leonard Fitch died in 1886 of a heart complaint, and his store was taken over by his son, a young man of 23 named Arthur Fitch, who had grown up watching the whole history of Celia Ford from behind his father's counter, and who treated Celia with a straightforward respect from his first day behind the counter that she received without comment, but that Wallace noticed and appreciated. In the spring of 1889, something happened that was small, but that settled something that had been unsettled. A letter arrived from Mason County in late April, directed to the Harrow Creek post office and addressed to the town marshal, a man named Dale Whitmore who had come to the position 2 years prior and was methodical and careful in his work. The letter came from a lawman in Abilene, Kansas, and it contained information about a man named Cole Pryor, who had been arrested in the Kansas Territory the previous fall for theft and assault, and had given a statement during his sentencing that included, among other things, a confession to a theft at a hotel in Harrow Creek, Texas, in October of 1882. Dale Whitmore read this letter and walked it over to Everett Baines's former hotel, now run by a couple named Hendricks, and then realized that Everett Baines was no longer present to receive any implications from it, which was mildly frustrating. He walked over to Ada Hollis's shop, where he knew he could find someone with full knowledge of the situation, and Ada read the letter and sat with it for a long moment and then said, very calmly, that she would like to pass the information along to the Weston family if he had no objection. Dale Whitmore had no objection. He was a careful man, but he was also a just man, and he understood what the letter meant to the people it most directly concerned. Ada brought it out to the South Road herself that afternoon. She did not send word ahead. She came in through the gate as she always did, and Celia was on the porch with Margaret on her hip watching Henry attempt to negotiate with a fence post, and Ada handed her the letter without preamble. Celia read it. She read it twice. She stood very still for a moment. Then she looked at Ada. "It is in writing," she said. "It is in writing," Ada confirmed. Wallace came around from the barn where he had been doing something to the fence line, as he was always doing something to the fence line, and Celia handed him the letter without speaking and watched him read it. He looked up at her when he finished. His expression was quiet and serious. "It was always true," he said. "You always knew it was true." "I knew," she said, "but it is different when it is in writing." He came up the porch steps and put his arms around her, and Margaret, who was accustomed to her parents' frequent proximity, accepted the inclusion with equanimity and grabbed a fistful of her father's shirt. "What do you want to do with it?" he asked. Celia thought for a moment. "I would like Dale Whitmore to read it at the next council meeting," she said. "Not to create a scene, just to read it, in front of Gerald Prout and whoever else is there, just to read it." "That is reasonable," Wallace said. "And then I would like to put it in the account books," she said, "in the section for records, as a record." "Done," he said. Dale Whitmore read the letter at the next town council meeting. Gerald Prout received it in the careful way he had learned to receive things about Celia Ford, with the measured discomfort of a man who was doing better than he had done, but was aware that doing better was not the same as having done well from the start. Several other council members heard it with expressions ranging from acknowledgement to relief. It was not a triumphant moment. Celia was not present. She had not wanted to be present for it, had decided the reading was sufficient, and that she did not need to be in the room to receive whatever the room chose to do with it. That was Wallace's instinct confirmed. She was not interested in the performance of vindication, only in the fact of it, in the correction of the record. The letter went into the account book in the records section in Celia's clear handwriting. Date, source, content, a plain entry in a well-kept ledger. The year 1890 came to the South Road Ranch with the comfortable fullness of a life that had found its form. Henry was 5, a serious and energetic boy who had inherited his mother's brown eyes and his father's habit of looking at things long and carefully before he spoke about them. Margaret was 2.5, decisive and loud and entirely convinced of her own rightness, which her parents found exhausting and delightful in equal measure. The ranch had expanded to 60 acres, the additional 20 purchased from a neighbor who was moving his family to Colorado and who offered Wallace first right of refusal. Wallace had talked it through with Celia over the account books the week before the offer came to its conclusion, and they had sat at the kitchen table with the ledger between them and worked through the numbers until the picture was clear. And then they had agreed together to proceed, as they agreed on all things that mattered, together and in plain language, and with the full weight of both their attentions brought to bear. Tobias Reyes had purchased his land the previous year, the creek access strip as Wallace had promised, and 2 additional acres to the west, and had begun building a small house on it with the help of both families. He was courting a young woman named Elena, the daughter of a ranching family from 3 miles south, and the courtship was proceeding with a seriousness that everyone who observed it considered very promising. Celia had given Elena a tour of the kitchen garden one afternoon, and Elena had been so interested in the planting methods that she stayed 2 hours and left with a handful of rosemary cuttings and instructions for how to start them. And Celia had come inside afterward looking pleased in a way she often looked when something useful had been passed along. Ada Hollies was 61 in 1890 and in good health and showed no signs of slowing down, which the people who depended on her, of whom Celia was the most prominent, found deeply reassuring. She had become something like a grandmother to Henry and Margaret, appearing on the ranch with regularity and bringing things she had made or found or thought of, and receiving their attentions with the brisk, deeply satisfied manner of someone who had always wanted grandchildren and had acquired them in the most roundabout and unexpected and perfect way. Wallace was 35 in 1890, and the years of work showed in the particular way that work shows on a man who has always been willing to do it, in the depth of his ease with physical labor, and in the way the land seemed to recognize him, which was Celia's description of it, that the South Road land recognized her husband, responded to his attention as it had not responded to the distracted ownership of the years before him. Celia was 30 years old. She was not the girl who had stood at the counter of Leonard Fitch's general store being invisible. She was a woman who knew the full value of her own competence and the full weight of the love she had built in this place, who had learned through a great deal of difficulty that you could survive being written off by the world as long as you did not write yourself off, and who had the additional knowledge, the knowledge that had come from a man riding down the South Road with a wagon full of tools and an instinct for paying attention. That the right person finding you was not the end of your story or the rescue from your story, but the beginning of the next chapter of a story that was always, at its deepest root, your own. She stood in the kitchen of the ranch house one October morning, with the rosemary in the window and the account books on the table and Henry at the door, asking about the horses and Margaret somewhere in the back room expressing a strong opinion about something in her characteristic way, and Wallace coming through the door from the porch with his hat in his hand and the morning light behind him. And she looked at him the way she had looked at him the first time he told her to keep the garden, with the look that asked whether it was real and gave herself the answer she had earned. It was real, it had always been real, it was the realest thing in the world. "Good morning," he said, coming into the kitchen and leaning down to kiss her, the easy, natural kiss of 2 people who had been kissing good morning for 7 years and intended to continue indefinitely. "Good morning," she said. "Henry wants to see about the horses." "I promised him," he said, "after breakfast. Margaret is explaining something at volume in the back room." "She usually is," he said, with the pride of a father who found his daughter's strong opinions entirely appropriate. Henry appeared fully in the doorway. "Papa, the horses." "After breakfast," Wallace said. Mama said after breakfast too, Henry said, with the scrupulous justice of a 5-year-old checking whether the adults were coordinated. We are in agreement, Celia said. Henry considered this and accepted it and vanished in the direction of Margaret's ongoing statement, and Wallace poured coffee and sat at the table beside the account books, and Celia sat across from him, and the morning went on around them, practical and warm and full of the daily texture of a life built on purpose and care. The south road beyond the window was quiet. The east field was in its fall state, the beans long harvested and the soil resting. The creek ran silver through the cottonwoods where the kitchen garden had grown since 1883, still tended, still producing. The original rows long since expanded, but the original corner still marked by the post where Wallace had first stood and told her to keep what she had planted. The town of Harrow Creek sat 2 miles north along the road, unchanged in its fundamental nature, still capable of the same failures that small communities were always capable of, but also, imperfectly and by degrees, capable of learning what it had gotten wrong, which was the best you could ask of any community and which was enough. In the account book on the table under the section marked Records, the letter from the Abilene lawman sat in its proper place, documented and filed and settled, the last open thread of an old story, neatly closed. Outside, the hill country morning was clear and large and full of light, and Henry Ford Weston was requesting the horses with escalating urgency, and Margaret Ford Weston was explaining the world to no one in particular, and Wallace Weston drank his coffee and looked across the table at his wife, who looked back at him with the full open warmth of someone who had been found and knew it, had chosen it, had built it with her own hands into something that would last as long as the land itself. Which was the best kind of forever there was.